Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second week of our course of the Economic History of Latin America. I am Ivan Luzardo. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And I am delighted to introduce you Fernando Arteaga. Fernando is the academic director of the Penn Initiative for the Study of the Market, and he will be our second lecturer. So welcome, Fernando.
Thank you, Ivan. So let me share the screen. There. Okay, let's start. So we are going to be talking today about the pre-Columbian economy. But before we do, I want to devote a little time explaining why do we start the course here. So as you can see, this is a graph from the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, where the indigenous populations of each country are traced. You can see that there is a huge heterogeneity from Bolivia, which more or less traces to 2/3 of the population, to Peru, which is almost 1/4, and Mexico, which is 15%. And then we have other cases such as Brazil and Uruguay, where the population is not as large. So of course, the huge heterogeneity depends on the histories and trajectories of these countries. It also more or less depends on how you define as indigenous. So there's a huge debate about the real amount of indigenous people because we have not yet recognized a good way to measure who is and who is not indigenous. The most common ways that we have to acknowledge what an indigenous is either by asking him, and it's basically auto-perception, or basically by the ability of the population to speak a native language. But it could be the case that basically a Native American actually did not know their original language. In any case, well, this speaks more or less about the importance of indigenous people today. So this is a large chunk of people that still exists that traces its history to the original Native Americans. Now, of course, that is hugely important. Nonetheless, the emphasis that I want to make of why this is hugely important for the whole population, for the whole of Americas, is not only that there's still people that identify itself as indigenous, but even for those people that do not identify, there's still a legacy, a deep historical pattern that depends on how basically the societies constructed their organization and how later the colonial period adapted to such institutions. So let me start basically by talking about some of the narratives that we have come to adopt in our day-to-day basis about the origins of our respective countries. And I'm going to look into basically two main narratives. You can talk about basically what is known as the Black Legend, for example, which is kind of propagated around the 16th, 17th century in the Netherlands and England, which more or less tells the story about the Spanish and Portuguese colonialists coming to Americas and basically destroying all the native societies. That is, of course, a very negative view on the Spanish people, on the colonizers. And this is, of course, some view that has, at some point, several truths. But I would say that that's not the whole truth. And also, and most importantly, it erases agency out of the indigenous people. So that's one view that still is prevalent among some Latin Americans. The second one is more or less the Rose Legend, which is kind of total opposite in terms of how do we see colonization. Basically, the view is that the Spanish and Portuguese came to the Americas to civilize, to make culture, to basically prepare the indigenous peoples to a modern world. And again, I think there's some certainty of truth in it, but I don't think the whole truth is in that as well. In any case, both of these views, however, share kind of the same perspective about the idea that the colonization of the Americas was like a tabula rasa, basically erase everything that occurred before. What I want to stress is that that is not the case. In order to understand the evolution up until the development recent of the Americas, we need to stress that there is a linearity between what was happened before, even before the colonization, in the pre-Columbian period. And this is why it's important to study this aspect. But before we dwell on perhaps the most known aspects of pre-Columbian America, which relate to what happened with the Aztecs and the Incas, we need to go far more back, further in time. So I will talk a little bit more in terms of the first inhabitants of America. Our guest next lecture on Thursday will is an expert on the Aztecs and also on the Incas, so he will have more time talking about them. If we have time now, I will also talk a little bit about them. Before we start on talking about this, I want to devote a little time explaining the power of basically educated guesses, and basically how do we construct knowledge when we lack appropriate data. Like, of course, when we go back in time, we start losing measurements. We don't have any more GDP data. We have to either estimate it through some proxies or just try to have educated guesses. So this guy here is José de Acosta. He's a Spanish Jesuit friar that visited the Americas in the 16th century. He basically arrived into Panama and spent a lot of time in Peru, but he also went to Mexico and other parts of the Americas. So he was he visited a lot of parts. He published in the late 16th century this book about the history of the Indies. And in it, besides just talking about Aztecs and Incas, he provided the first kind of educated guess about how the first inhabitants of the Americas arrived into the Americas, which is an important, of course, topic. And he provided the first hypothesis that later on through the centuries has kind of been proved, which is the idea that the early Americans, or what later came to be the early Americans, basically came from Asia through the Bering Strait in Asia. So just a little bit of context here. I'm going to base a lot of what I'm going to present this on this textbook by David Meltzer. And I want to show you this mostly because, and as a preface to what I'm going to do. So if you look here in this picture, what we have is kind of one of the artifacts that archaeological evidence finds. And this is important because when I will be talking at several points across the lecture about maybe more advanced, less advanced societies, cultures, more complex, less complex societies, but this is not a term that I use in a moral way. This is by any means some sort of assessment between the value of different cultures. This is just some way to assess that at some point, several cultures, several societies have achieved more cooperation, more organizational structures that have allowed them to produce artifacts that we know have more complexity. And this is akin more or less to what last lectures Professor Jesus talked about between South Korea and Argentina. If you remember the graph, the time series in terms of the GDP estimates of Argentina and South Korea in the 20th century and how basically they deviated. And the example he provided was more or less of why Argentina was not producing either electric cars or computers or smartphones or like that. So we will be talking about kind of those assessments. Of course, we'll not be talking about computers or electric cars. We will be talking about differences in terms of the complexity of the artifacts that each society can or cannot produce, either because of the abilities of the societies or also because of the geographical constraints that they may have. So what we know about the first humans in Americans, there's a lot of contest. And before we do, I just want to preface this also with the notion that this is something that could and most likely will change in the coming years. Just in the past 10 years, as we will see, our knowledge about this period of the time has changed tremendously because of new technologies that are available to us in order to attest basically the dating of the artifacts and the dating of the populations, but also because basically we have more evidence, we have more excavations, and so we have better knowledge. So in this sense, this is something that I will present that will maybe change in the coming years. And it has changed, as I told you before. So our first hypothesis, of course, is that humans came through Asia, through the Bering Strait. That has been kind of proved. And we more or less have an idea that they arrived almost 15,000 years ago or before present. And here maybe I make a digression because how we measure time frames in terms of this aspect of this period is kind of different to the way in which we measured for, let's say, Teotihuacan, Incas, or societies like that. It's not current era or before current era or after current era. We talk in terms of before present or years ago. And this more or less stems from one of the most important innovations in the 20th century, technological innovations, which is basically carbon dating that allowed us to really estimate how old certain artifacts were. And this was more or less a positive externality out of the nuclear research after World War. So Willard Levy is this guy here. He more or less kind of created this now common use technique by which basically we know that organic beings more or less exchange carbon with their environment. And there's a specific subtype of carbon, isotope 14, that more or less decays at a given rate through time, and through a ratio between decaying of said carbon 14 and other types of carbons, we more or less can attest basically how old an artifact, an organic being is or not. And so that this of course revolutionized the way in which we think, and a lot of our knowledge comes from this period just because of this technological tool. And so basically years ago depends very much on the period in which this was invented. So we have now come, after more evidence has been found, that really humans have been inhabiting Americas for more than that. So we now have evidence of more, even to 26 and even 30,000 years ago. So there's a lot of debate about this. So this is a map about some excavations, some recent excavations. The early ones that more or less the history of the archaeological evidence is one, the first important evidence was found in Clovis culture, which is New Mexico, that more or less attested to the original hypothesis about how humans came, that more or less coincided with what is called the last glacial maximum. So in order for humans to travel from Asia to America, more or less the world had to be at least some cold for basically land to exist between Siberia and what today is Alaska, so between Asia and America, but not that cold as to forbid, as to basically make the passage impossible. Because at some time the world was so cold, of course, that everything here was blocked by ice and mountainous ice. So we know evidence of, because of geological evidence, that more or less in the 15,000 years ago, there was a passage created in North America that allowed certain groups of people to arrive. And so when the Clovis evidence was found, basically, and the Clovis evidence is basically this point, that had a peculiar pattern that is interesting just because that pattern was not to be found elsewhere in the world. So that was unique to Americas. So that spoke of a unique culture within the early Americas. And this evidence, the dating of this evidence coincided with the opening of this passage. Well, we have the first evidence of the coming of Americans. Now, after that, a lot of other sites become available, started to pop up around all Americans. And one of the most important that challenged the origins of Native Americans, of the early Paleo-Americans, that is where what the archaeological evidence talks about this, guys, is about Monteverde in the south of Chile. And it's a huge, important archaeological site, mostly because there's a lot of evidence in terms of not only of artifacts, in terms of tools or stones, but also some kind of woods, some kind of settlement, early settlement. And not only was this settlement older than the Clovis, but also, well, it's just in the south of basically of America, which more or less tells us the story that if someone arrived here, well, it must have arrived much, much earlier than 15,000 years ago, just because, well, you need to take a lot of time going from Alaska up to South America, right? So this created a huge debate. And up until now, people still debate it. Nowadays, I think now every archaeologist recognized the importance of Monteverde and acknowledged that the dating is correct. But nonetheless, a lot of these sites have been opening since then, and it has been challenging the consensus of when the first Americans arrived into North America. So for example, this one is for Midcrout Rock Shelter here in Pennsylvania. So another site which is older than Clovis. And this one is more recent in Chiquihuite. So Chiquihuite, only a couple of years ago, more or less in northern central Mexico, a cave was found where basically we found artifacts that are to be dated between 30,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago. This, of course, has created a huge controversy. Not everybody agrees that these are human-made, but I mean, there's still, it's up to debate. We have also footprints. Here is for white sands in New Mexico. We have also found bones in Belsley, in where it is close to Vancouver. So we have a kind of a lot of evidence, and there are a lot of debates about how dated these are. And so how do we know really how old are these artifacts and how old are the early settlements of Americans that arrived into the Americas. So we have been talking about the archaeological evidence. I already talked you a bit about how carbon-14 dating works. Most recently, another technique that has been available to basically humans and archaeologists is this thing called optically stimulated luminescence. I won't presume to tell you how it works because I really do not know how it works. I just know that it acts more or less similarly to carbon dating, but actually it works for non-organic materials, and it works basically through the tracing of heat within certain stone limes and so on. And so with that technique, we are now basically, we can assess dating for things that are not organic. So that's a new technique that just recently got available to us. Another one, which we will talk in just a moment, that has revolutionized the way in which we think about the early Americans is just about genetics. So, and this has changed in the last 10 years, as I will show you in just a moment, because now we have access to bones, coprolites. Coprolites are basically fossilized poo. And also a third one is just looking into linguistics, just looking into your language. We more or less can trace the evolution of languages because we know how similar some certain languages are and how not similar are certain other languages are. So just by assessing the diversity between the different languages and looking into basically the history of the evolution, how common words exist, we more or less can assess the certain paths, trajectories of different early societies. And if we combine all of these three, of course, we can have kind of early ideas of the early inhabitants of the Americas or in general of the world. So we already talked a little bit about the archaeological evidence. I won't go much further into that. It's just more evidence of photos, pictures that you may see. This is for Buttermilk Creek in Texas, just some of the artifacts that we have found that show evidence of basically human-made characteristics. This is the tomb in Monteverde, which, as I told you, it revolutionized the way in which we think about the early inhabitants. But looking into DNA, which is something that I have not talked. So almost everything that I will talk about is summarized quite neatly in this book by David Reich, which it talks not just about the early Americans, it really talks about how we have discovered where we come from as a human society since the early Africans. So if you want to read more about it, I would recommend this book. So this graph more or less tells us how important the genetics revolution has been for our understanding of the world in general. So this is just kind of the amount of samples of genome data that we have had for the last 20 years. And as you can see, more or less since just 10 years ago, we really start having data. Before that, we really don't have anything. And we now have a different kind of problem. This is kind of difference between the samples that are being collected and the samples that have kind of been organized and published. And so there's a huge gap. So now we are basically in a world where basically we have more data available than the one that we can process, which is a different problem of what happened occurred 20 years ago where we did not have any kind of data. And of course, this new set of data, of new evidence, has changed the way in which we think about human societies and the arrival of Americans into America. So as we all know, so the early basically humans or the early came from the chimpanzees almost 7 million years ago. Then the modern anatomically humans first start to pop around basically 320,000 years ago, which is basically humans that basically morphologically at least they are the same as us, technically speaking. They are, of course, culturally different, but if they are transposed into a modern world, they will be indistinguishable to us. What I want to actually emphasize here is the division between the different areas. And as you can see, the most recent division is that of the Native Americans. If we compare to the Africans, we show the largest diversity because that's where basically the origins of humankind exist. Then later they move to Eurasia and to East Asia. And basically Native Americans, of course, come from East Asia, but they are a different set of people, which again, it makes sense in the sense that this is the last part of the world that actually got inhabited by humans. So I want to present here some of the, basically a map of the early hypothesis of how we came. So as I already told you, the early archaeological evidence shows us that we arrived almost 15,000 years ago, more or less, through basically the Bering Strait, arrived through the passage of in North America to the breaking of ice into Clovis. We now know, nonetheless, that this is not an event. So this is more like a process that occurred 2 times. So we have evidence of at least more or less 4 waves of people arriving from East Asia up onto North America and South America. The first wave, most importantly, did not arrive really through the opening of the passage here of the ice. They arrived a bit earlier, and this is how we can consider the archaeological evidence to the idea that the earliest people arrived to Alaska, and then they went with the coast to the coast here, and then they went to the south, up to Mexico, and later North South America, and then to the southern point of South America. So this is what is known in the literature more or less as the first Americans. This was the first early wave of people that arrived. Interesting enough, there's kind of a division here between people that arrived basically through the Andes and later other people that arrived into Brazil. This is important because we have found evidence of genetic similarities between some people here, just a small percentage, and people in Australia, for example, the early inhabitants of Australia. So that speaks of what we call in the literature maybe ghost populations, which are populations that arrive into Americas that we do not know much about because they maybe wouldn't have found any evidence, but they nonetheless interrelated with the people that that they arrived with, that they were different. So we have found evidence of people in the Brazilian Amazonians that share at least some sort of genetic genome data with people in Austria that are different from the other people that arrive here. And these these dots here are basically different teams of geneticists that have collected samples in several points in the Americas. They are different teams, have collected different information, but more or less they coincide on this. And I guess this map kind of summarizes everything pretty neatly about the early waves, but the process of the arrival into Americas from the first Americans that they arrived from the coast, they went to Mexico, then to South America. This is kind of what is known in the literature as the white population. This is what I've been telling you. These guys share a bit of DNA with the Australians, the early inhabitants of Australia. But then we also have a second wave that arrived through the passage that more or less coincides with the Clovis dating and datings around here that are different from the early first Americans. And so this also an early controversy in archaeology that we will talk in just a moment is about linguistics. So as you will see, there's a huge linguistic diversity, not only in America, but in all North America, there's a huge diversity. And so one of the early hypotheses is that there were different, basically, set of people that arrived. And this more or less has kind of given credence to that idea, to the idea that these were not the same set of people. There's a huge heterogeneity, a huge diversity of languages spoken in North America. And not only because of these basically 2 waves, but because later on we have found evidence of at least 2 other big waves that came from East Asia that mostly settled in northern parts, the Paleo-Eskimo languages, for example, here, and the Naden speakers. So this is just kind of a summary of genetic evidence. We do not need to go much more further into that. This is just kind of just to give you an idea that there's a lot of debate about here, and to stress more or less that this was more a process rather than an event that occurred at one point in time. Now, looking into the linguistic evidence, as I told you, there are almost 300 spoken languages north of Mexico, which kind of attest the importance of the diversity there. But before we go and explain why that's important, let's look into how do we actually know how the trajectories of the different languages. And really, this is also contested. How do we define what a language is? I mean, there's of course consensus, but the whole idea of how to assess how similar one language is to another is kind of difficult to assess. And I have 2 examples here just to talk about it. So let's talk about Castilian Spanish and Mexican Spanish. Generally speaking, of course, they are the same. Really, a Mexican, I would go to Spain and I could understand almost all the vocabulary. There's some local words that I will not understand, but they are just minimal and there's no problem. And I would say the same is for all the other countries in Latin America and Spain. So when we look into Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, it's a little bit more interesting because they are mutually intelligible, but maybe they would have more differences between each other. But at the end of the day, I would say that a Brazilian going to Portugal and know just a few days, few weeks, he will actually be at home just speaking Portuguese there. And the opposite is true, a Portuguese going into Portugal. Perhaps a more interesting case is just to look into Galician and Portuguese. So Galicia is a region north, western part of Spain. It's just north of the border of Portugal. And we can assess, are these different languages? Are these the same languages? I mean, they are different in terms of how we define it now today. So here is one example. And when we look into the evolution of languages, we have to look for one standard that is common to both, one kind of piece of text that has not changed through time. So basically, prayers are kind of ideal for that. They are originally in Latin, so we can trace how they change. And here are texts both in Latin, Galician, and Portuguese. And I won't presume how to pronounce this either in Galician or Portuguese, but generally speaking, you can see that there is no much difference. So we can more or less say maybe they are not so much different as to actually be merited, actually to merit this to be different kind of languages. And this gets more complicated when we talk about politics. The prime example is Serbo-Croatian, which is kind of the language of Yugoslavia, which after the Balkanization of the area, basically now the Croats would say that they speak Croatian and the Serbs would say that they speak Serbian. But generally speaking, I could say that they are more or less kind of the same. Of course, they are written in different alphabets, Latin, Cyrillic, but this could be more like a product of politics rather than of real differences. Now, when you look closely into the linguistics of Americas, this is where the interesting part lies, is that there's a lot of languages, but not only that. The languages that we have found, a lot of them are isolates. What is an isolate? It's basically a language that has no common ancestor or common characteristics with other type of languages, which implies, again, it talks about the huge diversity in terms of the inhabitants that really came first to the Americas. There are at least 21 additional languages in Mesoamerica. And if we compare it here, and really to understand this point, we really need to compare it with the Indo-European family. And basically, a lot of languages that are so common today come from the Indo-European family. Both Portuguese and Spanish, of course, come from the Indo-European family, but also Russian, and it's called Indo-European because also we also have found Hindu languages that are related to the Indo-European family. So even though they may appear as they are too different, at the core, they share similar characteristics. And at the end of the day, if you want to learn even Russian, it may be not as difficult as maybe if you want to learn Chinese, which is a totally different languages. So this is just kind of example for you to have an idea of the huge diversity that exists in the area that speaks of this evidence of early and repeated patterns of settlement. So this is a map of some of the languages spoken in South America. Again, huge chunks of different languages that maybe are not mutually intelligible between each other. Again, huge diversity. So how do we know exactly? And the specific methodology, we owe it to Morris Aldrich that more or less created this technique to allow us to understand precisely how this works. And it's called glottochronology. This, of course, is more complicated than what I will explain, but just bear with me for the moment. So Swadesh basically collected more or less 100 to 115 core terms. So these are concepts that more or less repeat in any languages because they are basically necessary, like conditionals, just if is one conditional, and words like to refer to our parents, mother, father, words to refer to numbers, at least the first numbers, 1, 2, 3, they are so necessary for the existence of society. So these are basically descriptions of things that all societies use. And these are core aspects of languages that makes it different. And these core definitions are quite resistant to change, even through the passage of time. They do not change. So the examples, of course, English and Spanish is 1 and 1. There's really not much differences in that regard. And an interesting example that allows us to understand this concept better is just to look into the evolution of the English language. So we know a lot of the history of how the English island became populated, how its population came to exist in the first place. So we have a lot of evidence about that. So we know that 50% of English vocabulary comes from French. And why is that? It's because in the 11th century, Norman invasions, basically people from northern France, basically invaded the island of England, and basically the elites were replaced, and a lot of the language, of course, was replaced. However, nonetheless, even though 50% of this English vocabulary comes from French, 96% of the English 215 core terms are Germanic, which is why we tend to think of English as a Germanic language, even though it borrows a lot of words from French. So this is from earliest patterns of settlement from the Anglo-Saxons in the Dark Ages. So this kind of speaks about how we can assess the mutations in terms of, we can assess the patterns of settlement according to the basically mutations in the language. So we have historical evidence for languages with well-documented records. We have more or less an assessment that 40% change per 1,000 years in the 100 terms list and 90% in the 250% list. And we can be talking more about this in detail, but I don't think we should go more. Perhaps Spanish and Portuguese is one interesting example because it suggests that they separated 750 years ago. Just about estimating how the change ratio between core and vocabulary languages. So and this is how we know about languages. And this also kind of combines with the archaeological and DNA evidence to attest for basically the summary that I just provided about the early inhabitants of the Americas. Now, moving on into looking into the early societies. Now that we have kind of a general idea about the patterns of settlement early on of the first Paleo-Americans, let's look into what happened in the Americas, the organization of the first sedentary societies. And before I go in depth into some of these specific cultures, I want to give you a general idea of some common generalities for the whole area, for the whole Americas, and what perhaps make the Americas interesting or relevant compared to the old world, to Eurasia. First, what sources do we have? We have ethnographic accounts from basically the early Spanish and Portuguese settlers that basically brought a lot about what they saw. We also have archaeological evidence about the many artifacts that these civilizations and these societies left, not only in terms of the stones or the early points that I just showed about the Clovis culture, but of course now we have, the more time has passed, the more advanced societies become, so the more traces they left. So of course we have buildings, we have a lot of monuments, pyramids across Mesoamerica, Central America, and the Andes. But we also have ceramics, for example, we have jewelry, we have traces like that. And now we also have DNA analysis, which more or less allows us to trace the evolution of certain kind of societies. Now, there are at least two distinctive characteristics that make the region Americas interesting for the study of the evolution of societies, human societies overall. The first one is that there is no extensive use of metallurgy. There's use of metallurgy devoted primarily basically to the creation of jewelry. And as I will show you, there's a lot of nice crafts, nice artisan artifacts created, for example, in gold or in other precious materials that are quite complex in how they created. So we know that early American societies were capable of creating these complex goods just because art is quite complex. But nonetheless, we don't have evidence of the usage of metallurgy for the production of tools. There is one tribe, one society in Canada, it's not even in Mesoamerica or Central America, that more or less uses copper, which is kind of the only evidence that we have of a society that uses copper. These are close to the Lake of Ontario, where basically a native copper mine is found. So generally speaking, copper cannot be used just like that. It needs to be processed, which implies that you need to invent a technique in order to process it. That's the way in which most other societies in the old world have kind of used copper. But in this part of Canada, basically the society basically had access to copper that was basically ready to use. And we have found evidence of tools made of copper. But besides that, we don't have evidence. And now we can start talking about a hypothesis of why this is the case. And the most important case is that, well, maybe there was already a substitute for the usage of some certain metallurgical objects. And here is where, of course, when we think about Mesoamerican societies, for example, we think of obsidian. And obsidian is a quite nice and rigid stone-like material. So, for example, the early Spanish conquerors, when they were fighting the Aztecs, they wrote a lot about it. They acknowledged that the Aztec weapons, which were made of obsidian, were capable of basically cutting the head of a horse with just one stroke. So that implies that these obsidian tools are quite good. So one early hypothesis is that the early American societies, for example, had alternatives that maybe were better for at least an amount of time, rather in their specific context, rather than they do not have the incentives to actually go and create better other tools, because obsidian was already readily available. That's one kind of the examples. Now, that's one characteristic, no extensive metallurgy. The second one, which is also perplexing, is that we don't have evidence of actually use of animal muscle for transportation or plowing, with the corollary that wheeled vehicles never develop in the region. We have found evidence of wheels or wheels used kind of in toys. Again, it's very similar to jewelry. We know that these guys knew about it, but we don't have found any usage of the wheel or animals in basically carrying objects, which again, it seems such an intuitive idea, in the sense that if we look into the history of humankind in Europe or in Asia and in the Middle East, we see that these societies, Mesopotamia, Egypt, they more or less found the usage of these kind of tools very early on, but not in America. And this is striking because these are not uncomplex societies. These are quite complex societies that created huge buildings, and they did without help, basically. And now, this is also perplexing in other ways. And this is not unique only to American societies. Up until very late, for example, there was no evidence of use of roads and wheels in Africa, and some societies in Africa. So there's kind of a literature that has been perplexed by the lack of usage of these aspects and had created their own hypothesis. And this is not only just basically old. There's a paper by a Colombian economist, Javier Durant, that more or less tries to explain why within Colombia, in the 19th century, there were some places within Colombia that they used no roads and no vehicles. And so it's just in the 19th century. So after independence, there were still places in the Americas and in other parts of the world where no vehicles were used. So this is kind of a puzzle that why this is the case. And you can say, well, maybe in terms of the animal usage, there was no horse and there were no cattle like that. But in the South, they had llamas, for example. So yeah, it's kind of a difficult thing to really understand. The prime hypothesis, of course, is just looking into the topographical aspects of the Americas. So this is a map that was presented last lecture, but I think it speaks quite clearly about basically the context of these societies. So where does the first complex societies in the Americas start to be created? Well, in Mesoamerica here, and later, and before even in the Andean cultures. And what are the patterns that we see here in terms of the topography? Because these are rough places to live by. So these are not plains. There's a lot of variation in terms of the slope of hills and so on. So maybe in a context like that, vehicles would not be that useful. I mean, having a wheel would be useful if you actually want to go down in a downward slope, but it would not be as useful if you want to go upslope, right? It may not be. So yeah, that's kind of one of the earliest hypotheses of why this has been the case. Now, a third distinctive characteristic that I did not want to write as specific because really is one of the most contested is about the lack of written scripture within this society. Without the exception of the Mayan culture, which is the only that we have kind of a consensus that they created a written scripture, really other cultures did not have it, or at least not as complex as the Mayans did. So the Aztecs, they have kind of pictograms, but no way to really write. The Incas, same thing. No, they have pictograms, but no real complex way to write it. So how does these hugely complex societies that basically had the power to conquer and manage places very distant from their hometowns could survive without written records is also kind of a debate within the archaeologists. And we know that they were capable of doing another kind of thing. So we know evidence, for example, that within Mesoamerica, all of the cultures there, starting from the Olmecs, they were able to actually have very correct dating systems. So Mesoamerica is famous, of course, because of the Mesoameric calendar. The Mayans, of course, are the most famous for that. But in general, all Mesoamerican cultures were able to basically create very accurate dating systems according to basically the skies and so on. And in the south, in the Andes, we know that very early on, at least since the Wari culture, and most famously with the Incas, they were capable of creating highly complex accounting systems. When you look into the quipus, which quipus are basically these knotted patterns that basically allow the Incas and other Andean cultures to basically have accounting methods. And that's more or less one hypothesis of why the Incas created this sophisticated bureaucracy that allowed them to tax quite heavily and quite consistently and quite relevantly a lot of their conquered peoples. So we know that they were capable of that. And that's kind of a numerical system that is quite complex. And of course, that is quite relevant. But that, just as well as in Mesoamerica, does not translate to having a writing system. But there's a lot of debate about this. And that's why I did not want to write it as a distinct characteristic, because there are some people that said, well, it's contested the way in which we define what is a written scripture. So this graph more or less tells the story of the evolution of the early, basically Native American cultures from the domestication of the first crops. So we will talk about maize in just a moment, but the first one to be domesticated is squash, later other beans, and maize more or less almost 6,000 years ago. This is highly contested now because of genetic evidence. I will show you just in a moment. But this more or less allows you to understand the development of these societies in different parts of the Americas. And of course, the most complex societies were created in Mesoamerica, first with the Olmecs, later with Toltecs, Mayas, and later on, with the arrival of the Spaniards, they saw the Aztecs. And similarly, in the Andes, you see first what is the Norte Chico civilization, some chieftain societies, Wari state, and then the most famous, of course, because it's the closest to the arrival of the Spaniards, the Incas. So there's a huge debate in the literature about how do we actually assess the development of these societies from basically what we call rank societies, where are basically tribal societies that depend on chiefdoms, depend on societies or organization through basically cooperation of just a small amount of people up until the creation of states. And just by the definition of what a state is, it implies that it's capable of organize not just a couple of hundred people, but basically thousands of people. And when we look into some of the early archaeological sites, we will see that some of these sites were able to have populations, support populations that were larger than 100,000 people, which more or less compete with similar cities, large population cities in Asia and in Europe. So these were highly developed cities, at least when we arrived into the States. So there's some kind of hypothesis about how basically the transition between chiefdoms, tribal societies, chiefdoms to states, and we have kind of created categories. Archaeologists have created, anthropologists have created categories about how to assess the organization of societies by basically saying, well, would they no longer make decisions just to consensus, because again, consensus is useful if you have just a few amount of people, but if you want to support thousands, then you have to create a more complex hierarchy, and that's where we see the first theocratic states being created, where we have maybe a nobility, an aristocracy, or we have a top ladder ranking of people. Hierarchies based maybe on divine rights, because again, as I told you, most of these were theocracies. They depended very much on nobility that was justified and depended very much on their particular religious beliefs. There's a huge debate about kingship versus kingship. Kingship is basically the relationship between people themselves, like I'm related to you, we share kind of a common understanding and common background given our ancestors, to kingship, which is a more indirect form of governance because it depends on an unconnected linkage between us, which depends very much on our society and not between our blood connections. And so So that's more or less the way in which we assess this. If you want to learn more about this, which is all literature in archaeology, I would recommend you reading this book, which more or less compiles what was novel 20 years ago. I think still quite relevant because it's a quite summary of the literature. And it speaks a lot of the debates that the early archaeologists have in trying to assess the complexity of a society, depending on the organization of the society and how they evolve to these ranking systems. Within this book, we also find one of the earliest models of how the early societies were created or were developed. And this is an interesting model in the sense that it captures one interesting pattern that we see not only here in Mesoamerica or in Americas, but across all archaic states with basically ancient cultures, which is the whole idea that they have more or less these cycles by which there's a pattern of basically they just begin. There's a society that just starts. They are small and they are becoming highly complex. They create more things. They start conquering other places, but then they achieve a peak and then basically they collapse because Y or X reasons. There are different potential reasons of why a society could collapse. So the most studied parts in Americas that speak of this are the Mayan cultures. And it makes sense because when you think about the Mayan culture, you think about a lot of important cities that basically had their peaks at different points in times. So the Mayans, this is kind of early research about that. So don't think a lot about these graphs. So basically here in the horizontal axis is just a time series. And on the vertical axis is here's the average size of polities, or it's kind of a proxy for the complexity of said polities. And what we see, if we specifically think in terms of the Mayan culture, is that we can attest this dynamic cycle of the cultures. So the first one, this is called the pre-classic, because technically speaking, there are some differences in the amount of complexity that these different cultures could attest. So the classic means that the people here actually created more advanced artifacts, for example. And I know I'm oversimplifying, so but just bear with me. It's this kind of the general idea. But the pre-classic here is El Mirador. So here's an example of El Mirador. Mirador here is in northern Guatemala. And this is El Mirador. And honestly, this is one of the most fascinating views of any Mesoamerican basically archaeological site, just because it's basically in a lush jungle. It's just quite exotic in some sense, but just interesting to know that his huge pyramid actually was able to be created in this place. And I think this pyramid is the tallest, the largest in the Americas in terms of size of height. So it's even larger than Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is larger in terms of basically the base, but not in terms of the altitude. So El Mirador was the first. It achieved a peak, and later actually it decreased. Later on, Tikal is kind of the most famous archaeological site within Guatemala. South of Guatemala, in what today is Honduras, we also have kind of the city-state of Copan. And this is kind of the classic period of the Mayan culture. And later on, the post-classic is basically a lot of the archaeological sites in Yucatan, in Mexico, are basically in that place. Chichen Itza is the most famous. If you go to Yucatan, to Cancun, well, you most likely already know Chichen Itza, but there are other places. Tulum is also kind of quite nice site in the sense that it's very really next to the Caribbean. So how do we explain these patterns of growth and decay of these city-states in the Mayan region? So there's a lot of literature trying to explain this. One of the hypotheses is this tension, which I already kind of talked to you about, kinship versus kingship. Again, the whole idea is when societies first start, they basically interconnect through basically just close links. They start to develop. When they are kinship related, they need to be decentralized by nature because there are a lot of them and they are just very small. But when you start to increase the complexity, you need to find better ways of organization. And this is where kingship arises. And this is where things start to become centralized into one capital. That's what we call El Mirador. Maybe that's the largest, most important city in the Central America area that a lot of the other cities follow. But kingship tensions between kinship and kingship create, of course, problems because not everybody agrees to have basically these hierarchical systems. They more or less create revolts and create conflict. And so the decay more or less explained by that. So this is not as different as the way in which modern economists or modern persons actually attest basically conflict within the modern world. Just the idea that there's a division between how we divide, there's a problem between heterogeneity, and how do we concide centralized versus decentralized systems. So, and we can use this model not only to explain Mayan area, we can use it really to explain, as I already told you, almost all archaic societies. So this is just an example of how we could use the same kind of model to explain societies in central Mexico and also in the Andean cultures. This is just of central Mexico, so basically it does not talk about other cultures that are close by but are not really within central Mexico. So the first is basically the first layer polity in the areas Teotihuacan, later on Toltecs, and of course the latest one is the Aztec. And as I told you, do not pay a lot of attention into what the specific slope of these curves is, just to attest more or less in a figurative way, basically the increase in complexity of one society and later its decay and so on. When we look into the Andean culture, we have a similar pattern. We now have more evidence here that in fact the Andean cultures were the first ones to develop a state very early on, even before the domestication of maize, which has created a very interesting hypothesis of why that is the case, because naturally maize along with wheat and rice are the staple commodities that humankind have had in order to sustain itself. But nonetheless, one of the first complex societies in the Americas, the Norte Chique civilization, which is even older than this is capturing, really arose in Peru without basically the domestication of maize. But this graph more or less tells you kind of the evolution of these cultures. So first, I'm going to devote a little bit more time explaining what was happening in Mesoamerica, mostly because I honestly know a little bit more about it, but also because this is one place where maize was domesticated, which I already told you it's important. So the Neolithic revolution here, which is basically the transition from being nomad to sedentary, implies that you have kind of agricultural production. So the first production, of course, is on potatoes and beans on the Andes, which is one of the hypotheses of why these civilizations existed, because they had alternatives to maize. But nonetheless, still maize is quite relevant. And at the beginning, so there's a lot of contested ideas about the origins of maize, which no longer are contested, but they were in the 20th century. And this is where genetics helped us quite a lot, because one of the early hypotheses about domestication of maize, it was that it was developed more or less at the same time, both in the Andes and in Mesoamerica, just because we could not conceive civilizations to be created without access to maize as a commodity. And why is that? So maize, and even today, you look into maize. So what does why maize is useful? So maize as a direct source of food is very important to all the Americans. It's of course most important for Mexicans. Most of the Mexican gastronomy is derived, it's related to corn and maize, so tortilla and so on. So it's especially important to Mexicans, but in general, it's important to all Americans, and some parts of the world also consume corn. But most importantly, in today's world, basically maize is used to feed the cattle. So indirectly, maize is quite important not only to feed humans, but to feed the food that humans use. So in that sense, you could say that maybe maize is even more important than rice or wheat. Of course, this is a subjective assessment. And there's another use, which is basically to transform it to alcohol, to ethanol, which we now know that can also be used as a source of energy. The alcohol transformation is relevant if we want to understand some of the differences between Mexico and Andean cultures. Because as I will tell you in just a moment, really what you see is that within Mesoamerica, the domestication implies that most of the maize and corn will be used to really directly feed human civilizations. While in the south, in the Andes, mostly likely because they already had kind of alternative sources of food like potatoes and beans, they also use maize. They use maize not really as a direct source of food, which they use, but most importantly, they use for the production of alcohol. So chicha, for example, is still a beverage consumed in the Andean cultures, quite relevant for indigenous people there and in general for these populations. And a lot of these early societies use maize for that. Now, maize itself is interesting for pure scholar and academic reasons, in the sense that understanding the process of how we domesticate it is interesting in itself. So there is a geneticist that more or less talks about the idea that the domestication of maize is one of the greatest genetic engineering feats of humankind. Just look into this picture, which is basically, this is kind of modern cough, modern maize. And this is basically the origins of that. This is teosinte. It's a small plant found, this is endemical to a small part within Mexico, in the Balsas region in central Mexico. So this is the earliest form that later on derived in domesticated and created a maize. I have already talked about how humans are really kind of dependent on maize as a source for many things. But most importantly also is that maize itself is dependent on us to actually exist in the very first place. Or if you have eaten corn in the cob, you must have realized that it's quite difficult to take the cobs away from to just chew it, because they are really stuck together. So what that implies is that really there's no way that the maize could actually propagate itself in the wild. It requires humans to actually do it for it. So it is a creation of humans and they require humans in order to exist. Unlike teosinte. Teosinte here, as you can see here, these things actually are quite easy to separate. And of course, that implies that basically they don't need humans to actually propagate in the wild, because they just dissipate by the wind. What is important also is that, of course, how do we actually think, how do we feed from this particular aspect is interesting, because this is not tasty. So this teosinte still exists in the wild, and this is not tasty. So just by looking into how the earliest domesticators of teosinte into maize thought about it, it's interesting in itself, because we know that it took a lot of time for teosinte to actually live into corn, into maize itself. We know there's evidence of basically this early transition occurring 6,000 years ago in Oaxaca, Mexico. We have genetic evidence about this. That's why we can definitely say that maize comes from a particular region with Mexico, and we more or less can attest how early on there was a trade pattern. We think is trade, because it's a connection between how the teosinte moved, that really moved this teosinte plant that already had the characteristics that would lead into maize and would lead them to propagate all around South America. So this is kind of a comparison between what we now know as basically corn, maize, and this is kind of the teosinte plant. And basically, this is the things that later became these things. So this is the map of the propagation of maize. From its origins in Mexico, it moved to the north. So some arid American cultures in New Mexico or domesticated maize, some cultures in Mississippi domesticated maize, and it moved also to South America. So of course, the Andean cultures for the Mayans, the Andean cultures, and we have also evidence of domestication here presence of maize in what today is Uruguay. And we know this because we have, of course, made samples, genetic samples of the different kinds of maize and of the different kinds of the teosinte in general. And so this map is kind of the genetic sampling of where we have found evidence of the early domestication of maize. Compared to this is kind of the same. The earliest evidence of domestication is here, and then with the farther away we move from its earliest origin points, of course, we have that it domesticated much farther away. And there's no evidence of places in North America, for example, that never domesticated maize, and so parts within Brazil or in the southern points of the continent where maize was never domesticated. But again, this is also where basically archaeological evidence, genetic evidence kind of helps us understand better the way in which the early organization of societies occurred. And again, this is important because maize is a staple commodity that is kind of the most important crop for the sustenance of human societies. Within Mesoamerica, it's even more important. So one important characteristic that I have not talked a lot about, but I think is maybe interesting for you to know, and maybe even necessary, is that itself maize does not have the nutrition, all the nutritional components that make life possible. So it needs to be complemented. That's why in the South, in the Andeans, they complemented with potatoes and beans. In Mesoamerica, however, the early Mesoamericans invented a process which is called nixtamalization. It comes from Nahuatl, the Aztec language, which more or less is a technique in order to add the nutrients that corn itself does not have, and to make it basically nutritious for the consumption of population. And then it implies that the only thing that you need to consume is maize itself, but you need to put it to that process. And this is kind of a technique invented by the early Mesoamericans that other parts of the world did not use it. And of course, we also have evidence in terms of the pictorial evidence of how the early Americans use it. This comes from the early recollections of the Spanish people that arrived into America. We knew how they did it in the Aztec time. If you want to know more about this, which I think is a hugely interesting and complex subject, I will recommend you to read this comprehensive survey of the history of maize and this book by Michael Blake, which kind of provides a summary not only of why maize is important, but also about the history of how we got to know when and where maize originated in the first place. So at the end of the day, kind of the early history is not just a history about basically how these early societies got to exist in the first place. It's also an epistemic trip into how we as modern societies get to know things in the past. So this is important in several ways because it talks about how we need to be a skeptic in general, but also how we need to understand how knowledge is created in modern times. So this kind of also helps you understand what is GDP, for example. We need to be a skeptic about what GDP is. How do we measure development societies? So this is how we more or less can kind of unite our early assessments of archaeological evidence with how we as economists in the future, we also kind of measure economic development. So within the context, returning to this the Mesoamerican times, returning to why this was important in this early period. So what were the consequences of the domestication of maize? I already kind of talked a little bit about that. But of course, the main and most important consequence of having a staple commodity is that the population that you could support will increase quite a lot. I'm going to talk about Teotihuacan because it's one of the largest and most important societies to have developed here. But first, I want to talk about the earliest one, which is the Olmec one. So in the words of one Mexican archaeologist, the Olmecs are the mother culture of all the other Mesoamerican cultures. So it's the first culture that we have evidence that is quite complex in the products, in the artifacts that they produce. And of course, you may have seen the Olmec culture because when you Google what an Olmec is, you Google into Wikipedia, and basically you see these huge stones, headstones of people that have a distinctive morphology in how their lips and their nose are sculpted, which of course is amazing in itself. But besides that, there's a lot of evidence that is not as famous. And from the Olmecs, and this is why I want to talk with them first, the Olmecs are the first civilization in all the Americas that we have find a pictorial depiction of maize. And so, for example, this guy here is a depiction of the first maize god in Mesoamerica. So later on, we have maize gods in other cultures in Mesoamerica. More or less, we can think that they are a derivation of the Olmecs. And in general, an hypothesis that we have is that almost all of the basically pantheon of gods of the Mesoamerican cultures more or less are derived from the first Olmecs. So we have already kind of Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, which is basically the serpent god. We already had kind of an idea that it exists for the Olmecs. So that speaks more of the idea that the Olmecs were quite so relevant. And in the words of Michael Coe, which is an important archaeologist, which I want to read it because I think it's quite a neat phrase. He says, wherever the Olmecs did not go or where their influence wasn't felt, civilized life never took hold. Not even in the 2.5 millennia that elapsed between then and the Spanish conquest. Beyond the frontier of the Olmec realm were the barbarians, the people without calendar, writing and science, without great art, without states, uncivilized. So I think this phrase can capture quite nicely the importance of understanding the pre-Columbian past that goes way, way back in the past, because he's almost saying, even after the conquest of the Spanish, you can see that the place of the most complex organizational governance institutions, they are in the place where Olmecs had already arrived. Well, there was already a pattern that indicated that the Olmecs had already been trading. So this map particularly is this area here is where they basically we think the Olmec civilization existed. And these points here is where we have evidence of some Olmec artifacts had been found, which more or less attest that there was some type of contact between Olmecs and these other initial civilizations. We think that the Olmecs were, I mean, we do not know much about it, that's honestly, but the hypothesis is that this guy, the Olmecs went to all Central America and to the Mayan area in Central America and the Yucatan Peninsula, and then basically communicated and propagated knowledge. And this is where the centers where basically human societies started to pop up later on. So again, this is super important because it speaks of the importance of understanding the evolution of societies in terms of development complexity, not only in terms of institutions that were later that came later with the arrival of Europeans, but it speaks of the importance of adaptation. Basically, when people arrive, they have to adapt to a unique cultural and, of course, geographical context. And out of that adaptation, these new cultures are created. But in the beginning point, at least, it really can be quite old, as we can attest here. And so this is why we think the Olmecs are so relevant. And these are the first Mesoamerican society. There are older societies in the Andean cultures. They are interesting in themselves, but they are interesting in other ways. So I want to talk a little bit more about one of the largest Mesoamerican society, of which unfortunately we also do not know a lot about, even though they left this impressive site. So if you've been to Mexico City, Teotihuacan is really quite close by, just a very small trip from Mexico City. So I would bet that if you have been in Mexico City, you already visited. But if you come to Mexico, I will totally recommend you visiting this huge building complex. So this is the Pyramid of the Sun. This is kind of the most famous photograph aerial view of the complex. So this speaks more of the complexity. So one of our earliest estimates is that almost 100,000 people live in this complex. There is a lot to be said about it, but I want to concentrate more on some not as impacting evidence. And this is something that our guest next week is really an expert, because he basically has made a lot of these discoveries. But nonetheless, I think it's necessary to talk about it today. The first one, because it's quite contrasting to what we will see not only in other parts of Mesoamerica, but in the southern Andean cultures, and of course in other parts of America as well. It's quite contrasting. The first, more or less, hypothesis that we have is that the Teotihuacan, even though they were a large empire, there could be nonetheless quite egalitarian. And how do we measure kind of inequality in the old world, which is kind of different? We don't have access to Gini indexes or access to income proxies, right? So one way that we have to have this educated guess about why this was an egalitarian society is because first, we don't have evidence, for example, of any art that is devoted to depict kings or kind of nobility in a sense. And this is quite common for other cultures, that we more or less interpret the absence of evidence as speaking to us as the idea that maybe did not exist in the very first place. So that's one. A second, when we relate into how these people lived, all of these are the maps, and this is kind of the picture of basically the living complexes within Teotihuacan. And what you see is that they are similar in terms of its size. And this, again, contrasts to other parts of Mesoamerica and in the Andean cultures, where what you see is that living complexes are quite heterogeneous in the sense that they are diverse in terms of size. You have huge palaces where the nobility and the aristocracy and the kings live, and you have small slum-like complexes where the rest of the population lives. So you have contrasting evidence in terms of the size of where people live. Here, you don't see that. You see that basically where people live is basically quite similar, which again is kind of a proxy of that talks about the idea that these guys were equal in status. A second aspect that speaks about heterogeneity, and when here I'm referring to heterogeneity, is in the sense that these were not of one culture only, but they were from different kind of cultures. So we have found evidence of many artifacts that are basically divided by complex that more or less speaks that maybe there was a lot of migration from other parts of Mesoamerica, from different cultures that were different from the Teotihuacans, that nonetheless they live within this Teotihuacan complex, which I think is quite interesting and nice in itself. There's several hypotheses. Some says that maybe they were ambassadors, they were traders. Some people say maybe they lived there, so they're just kind of migrants that live in Teotihuacan. But again, this is quite striking just by comparing with other societies. We nonetheless know that Teotihuacan culture was a military superpower. We have evidence, depictions of basically warriors. So we have evidence, for example, we may associate eagle warriors and jaguar warriors with the Aztecs, but they existed all across Mesoamerican cultures. So this is, for example, a Teotihuacan eagle warrior. This is a map of what we believe is kind of the core area of the Teotihuacan society. And this, we know that maybe they had outposts in south of Mexico, in Central America. And because we know how to read Mayan, and now we now read Mayan, we have found evidence of written evidence of Mayan city-states that talk about people that came from Teotihuacan into the Mayan area. They conquered, they overthrew the local rulers, and they instilled their own monarchy in that place. So especially in Tikal, and as I already told you, Tikal is the largest city in the most important period in the Mayan area. So this is a huge city, a lot of population, the most advanced civilization in Central America. And we have found written evidence that at some point, the Teotihuacan culture or some invader from Teotihuacan came, visited, and then he instilled himself as basically the king of Tikal, which again, just by looking into the complexity of Tikal itself, it speaks about how much more complex or more advanced Teotihuacan must have been in order for them to be able to conquer this other complex society. And how do they achieve basically this organizational complexity in terms of military power? Well, one hypothesis is that they had control of a lot of goods that were imported, exported across Mesoamerica. One of the most important ones, as I've already told you, is obsidian. Obsidian is used all across Mesoamerica for tools, for weapons, and for many aspects. And so these are all least path routes calculated by a Mexican scholar that more or less traces the union of Teotihuacan here. So for example, Mexico City today will be here, Teotihuacan is here. So these are basically connections to different localities that are relevant to Teotihuacan and sources of input of goods, for example, cotton. Thin orange is basically the input that is needed to make ceramic. And most importantly, obsidian. The black ones are basically sources of obsidian. And particularly in Pachuca, there's a neat aspect that is called green obsidian, which was quite demanded by the Mayans particularly. If you look into the description of what a Mayan is, you will see that it has a lot of green obsidian, green jewelry, and green obsidian weapons as well. And so this is quite relevant because all of it came from Teotihuacan. So there must be kind of an economic way by which Teotihuacan could leverage and bargain better with respect to other civilizations that allow them to thrive in the first place and then conquer a lot of this area. And with this, I will conclude. I will, as I said before, when there will be an expert next lecture on Thursday that will talk more about Aztecs and Incas and some other important affairs of the Andean cultures. Thank you.
Hi, Fernando. So I have been answering some of the questions on the chat. So perhaps you can talk for 5-6 more minutes if you want, or we can just open and take questions from the audience.
As you like, I can continue. I mean, I can end a little bit of Teotihuacan maybe.
Yeah, why don't you go like for maybe 5 more minutes and then we ask. And if any of you is interested in asking questions, please write them in the chat and try to answer as many of them as I can. And that way we get a little bit more money for the time.
Okay, sure. So I will continue. So this is Teotihuacan, and this is why I think why it's so relevant. What we do not know, and again, there's a lot that we do not know about Teotihuacan, is how it decayed. Again, what we see in these dynamic models is that we see a period of growth, and then we see a period of decay. And we do not know exactly what caused the decay of Teotihuacan. And this is a common thing that we will see all across these cultures. We have hypotheses. Maybe the most common hypothesis is always environmental collapses, mostly because these are, of course, pre-modern societies that depend very much on some staple commodities like maize or beans or potatoes and so on. So that implies if you have kind of a bad weather for a long time, then that implies that basically your civilization would tend to decay after some period. So moving a little bit forward, a lot forward, the Teotihuacan was quite relevant. But this is a map that I think is interesting to notice. This is a map of what would the cultures of Mesoamerica would look like before the arrival, just immediately before the arrival of the Spanish conquest. And this is a map that I will talk more about next lecture when we devote more time to the colonization. But nonetheless, I think this is quite relevant because this kind of puts into evidence the idea that there was already kind of complex societies, and more importantly, the way in which the organization of these societies kind of matter for basically the adaptation that the Spanish did in order to put themselves in place. So let me just go a little bit into what this map implies. So the green area is basically the Aztec Empire, but they were not the only ones. So basically, if you have read anything about the Aztec, the conquest of the Spanish, the Aztec conquest by the Spanish, you must have heard about how the Spanish had some allies. The most important ones was the Tlaxcala Confederacy here. So they helped the most because they were the bitter enemies of the Spanish, and they helped actually conquering the Tenochtitlan. But there were another ones. So the Tlaxcalans were not the only ones. So the other ones that we must forget is kind of the Purepecha Empire, the Tzintzuntzan kingdom, more or less. These were bitter enemies of the Aztecs as well. In fact, after the conquest of the Spanish had to conquer all the other places. And they did that with the help of the other Nahuatl-speaking people, both the Tlaxcalan, but also by the conquered Aztecs. And they actually, I would say that the war against these guys was more bloody and take more time than the war with the Aztecs itself. So understanding this area is quite irrelevant. So as you also may realize, here's basically the second most, well, nowadays is the third most important city in Mexico, Guadalajara, is from this place. But so the relationship in how we understand Mexico today depends not only in terms of the process of the Spanish itself, but depends on how the configuration of the polities as they existed before the arrival of the Spanish. And of course, if we go to the southern parts of Yucatan and Central America, what you see is that we really do not know a lot about it because they were so decentralized that really we cannot say that there was a border in itself. So we don't have a lot of knowledge about it. But perhaps what is most important, and the one thing that I want to emphasize the most out of this, is that the common aspect of organization of the Mesoamerican cultures, and I will argue also of the Andean cultures, lies basically at the level of the community of the towns. So for example, in Mesoamerica, what you find is that you have these towns, these settlements, organized through the idea of altepetls. That's the name in Nahuatl, which is kind of the main Aztec language and the main language in Mesoamerica. Until today, I would say that this is the most spoken language in Mexico outside of Spanish, of course. But we have kind of the same definition in other languages, in other Mesoamerican languages. That's the Ka for the Mayans, the Nu for the Mixtecs, which are the population in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, which speak of the idea that the most important political organization level is basically the most important political jurisdiction was the settlement, the town. And the organization of empires depended very much on how these towns were linked between each other. And so this is kind of a map about how basically the organization of at the time of the Aztecs occurred. So at the lowest level, there were the most conquered towns, which were called sujetos by the Spaniards. They each had a cabecera. So cabecera was in charge, was kind of the capital of several other altepetls, other towns. But we also had provincial centers, which were basically kind of larger city towns that collected a lot of cabeceras. And of course, the central node of organization of the empire was Tenochtitlan. Now, I could say that a similar concept to the settlement or the Altepetl in Nahuatl existed in the Inca period or in the Andean region with this, the Ayllu. So if you have studied a little about the Andean region, you must have realized that the Ayllu is kind of a local community. And even after the Incas conquered, and the Incas were quite amazing at actually trying to Incaize, make more Inca the populations that they were conquering. Nonetheless, they left some room for autonomy to these settlements, the Ayllu. So at the very core, what I'm trying to say here is that the process of organization of the Americas before and after the arrival of the Spaniards, and again, this is something that we will talk more in the next lecture, depends very much on the organization at the city level. And the importance of this kind of is already explained in this pictorial. This is from the Codex Mendoza, which is when the Spanish arrived. They basically, before many of these people died, they made them kind of collect their history. So this is kind of the myth of the origin of Mexico or the Aztecs. They will create Tenochtitlan, later on Mexico City, in the place where they found basically an Aztec standing on a cactus and eating an eagle. So of course, this is noteworthy just because of the romanticization of what this implies. But I think most importantly is this one. So this is kind of an emperor, an Aztec emperor, and his empire consists in conquest of other settlements. And each of these pictograms is one distinct settlement, one distinct altepetl that this Aztec emperor has conquered. So at the end of the day, the way in which the Aztecs were organized was by basically they expanded from one city-state. So I could talk more about the Triple Alliance and a little bit about how the Aztecs themselves arrived from being kind of the underdogs and how they basically, to bargaining better positions, they created in self a little bit of power that later on allowed them to thrive more than the other societies. But the important thing is that they thrive, they start military expanding, they conquer a lot of altepetls, but they more or less respected the local autonomy. So the way in which these local altepetls organized was dependent on themselves. That implies that this guy actually enforced some sort of tributes or taxes to each kind of these cities. It will depend according to each. But the way in which this altepetl organized itself depended very much on how they wanted to do it. So there was no internal political interference of the emperor. So even though if we see that the Aztec Empire basically was composed of a lot of green area here, really all of these are basically settlements that had their own government in internal affairs. And this was also why when the Spanish arrived, it was so easy for them to actually make kind of bargains with them in order for them to go against the Aztecs, because they realized that the focal point of organization now for cooperation of the Mesoamerican tribes was changing, and the Spanish were favored. A lot of people actually, the first ones to ally themselves with the Spanish were the Totonacs, which are in the Veracruz here. Later on, of course, most famously Tlaxcala here. But at the end of the day, in order to understand the process of conquest, in order to understand the process of organization of Mesoamerica, and again, I will also argue in the Incas and in the Andeans, you need to look really at the level of these settlements. These are other pictorial evidence of basically what was tributed, basically the taxes that were paid to the Aztec settlement, and in terms of goods and in terms of military clothes. And when these towns did not behave, that means that they did not pay tribute or they rebel. But of course, the Aztecs will retaliate in terms of a punishing party, military punishing party. And I think with that, I guess we can conclude. We have 5 minutes, so I guess I can stay for more time to answer any other questions.
Yeah, there is like a couple of questions. Maybe if you look at the Q&A, or maybe Ivan can put it.
Yes,
I haven't tried to answer most of them.
Yes, Fernando, thank you very much for your presentation. So we have several questions on, for instance, there is one that asks about the Muisca civilization. So could you briefly comment something about the origins and the apparent particularity of the Muisca culture or subculture in the northern part of South America? According to some historians, they were not part of the Inca Empire.
So yeah, well, what we would see occurring, and this is something that our next guest will talk more about, of the comparisons between the Aztecs and the Incas. What you would see is that, I mean, I would love to have more time to explain more about the Andean civilizations, because first they appear first than in Mesoamerica, and they are different in the sense of the sources of how they interact between each other, in terms of how they sustain themselves. One of the things that I try to emphasize is that maize was basically the only staple commodity. Well, it was not the only one, but this was really the core aspect of sustenance for the Mesoamerican societies, but it was not so for the Andean region. In the Andean region, in fact, what you see is that there is a lot of coastal fishing. And so it's interesting because in itself, it implies that some societies could thrive even without access some staple commodities. So that's interesting in itself. And what you look, I mean, I don't know the particulars of the Mojisco culture itself, but what I know is that a similar pattern that you experience in the Aztecs, as the Aztecs occur in the Incas. That means that the Incas were more furious in conquering their neighboring tribes, were more serious in terms of trying to make these new conquered territories part of its own empire, more than the Aztecs. But nonetheless, there was still room for internal organization of the way in which they reorganize, as long as they more or less share some cultural attributes with the Incas. And there were, of course, some tribes that resisted the Incas. And so when Pizarro and the early Spanish conquerors arrived, they, as Cortés did with the Aztecs, they also more or less took advantage of these enmities and of the internal conflicts that existed previous the arrival of the Spanish. And so that was kind of the weakest point of, I would say, all the pre-Columbian Americas upon the arrival of the Spanish.
Yeah, let me point out to everyone, sorry, Ivan, for a second, that I try also to answer this question on the chat, and I posted 3 books about the culture. They're in Spanish, unfortunately, but I suspect that if you are interested in this culture, it's because probably you're from Colombia. So reading Spanish should not be the most difficult challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernando Villaverde. So we have another question about the indigenous caciques. So the question is, could you please tell us a little bit more about the role of indigenous caciques? So do you consider that there is a connection between the pre-conquest political complexities of indigenous group and the presence of the powerful indigenous caciques, at least up to the 19th century?
Yeah, totally. There's totally a connection here between the political organization in the 19th century, the political organization after the conquest, and the political organization before the conquest. So as this is something that I will talk more about in the next lecture, but nonetheless, let me kind of give you a brief overview of why there's a connection in the first place. As this hierarchy of settlements implied that if you were kind of the leader of a cabecera, which is basically a settlement that basically received tributes from other altepetls or other city-states, that means that you were basically would be considered the cacique of those areas. So through time, what occurred is that the position evolved, the form of tribute, of taxation, of course, changed. In the pre-Columbian period, it could be in terms of goods, like the pictograms that I just presented to the Aztecs. So that meant that what particular settlement made tribute to the Aztecs. Sometimes it could be forced labor. That's where the encomienda comes. So I will talk more about the encomienda system later on. Sometimes the encomienda leader was an indigenous cacique, because again, the Spanish, when you think about the Spanish conquest to the Americas, just look into how many of them arrived, just to put this into perspective. They were between 500, 1,000 people. They received kind of more people after some period, so there was reinforcements, but there were 1,000 people arrived. There are debates about how many people existed previous to the arrival of the Spaniards. At least within Mesoamerica, one of the figures is that there were 25 million. So just put into perspective, how do 1,000 people conquer 25 million? And then how do 1,000 people govern 25 million? And of course, there's a decay in the amount of population because of diseases and so on, but we'll talk about that next lecture. But the only way to do that is precisely to rely on previous forms of organization. And the indigenous cacique is basically kind of that we see later on, the cacique itself, the figure of the cacique, of the way in which municipalities in the Porfirian period in Mexico, at least, more or less evolves out of this tradition of self-reliancy of each city-state that have kind of other city-states under its umbrella, because there's a hierarchy. It's not every society was at the same level.
Okay, thank you, Fernando. So there is another question about state coordination and state formation. So actually the question is that we analyzing state formation, so we can see that with the classes from the present times, I mean, if we can classify societies as socialist or capitalist societies.
So if they are socialistic or capitalistic?
Yeah, if we can, if these kind of categories are relevant for the pre-Columbian.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate, and here's where basically not just between archaeologists and economists, or it's between historians and economic historians. It's really difficult to assess how much these societies are producing for the market. The other hypothesis that is commonly studied in history is that most of the societies, not even just in Americas, in pre-Columbian Americas, all across societies up till the Industrial Revolution, some historians will say that most of the societies will actually produce for self-consumption, and if they had a surplus, they will later trade on. I myself, just by looking into specifically the Aztecs, I would say that they produce for the market. There's a market. I did not have time to go that, but there's a market in Aztec. The trade interactions, at least in Mesoamerica, are quite important. There's a whole guilds created for the transportation of goods. There's whole guilds created for the production of several goods, and there are scheduled meetings where people that produce and people that demand those productions will meet and exchange their goods according to some currency. There were some sort of price regulations, of course, and there were some limits into what you can buy and sell. And just as in any pre-modern society, basically the traders, they were not the highest part of society, because this is really kind of a modern way of understanding society. But nonetheless, they're kind of, you can say, I mean, I wouldn't say that they were capitalistic in any way of the world, but they were market-oriented at least. This is kind of different in the Andes, where what you see is that trade occurs. I mean, trade occurs technically in all societies at different points in level. At the end of the day, the discussion is how core is trading for the sustenance of any of these societies. And in the Andean regions, I would say they are less important in the sense that these complex organizations did not arise. It was more like the example of the Incas is that they created this huge public infrastructure of roads that basically united all the empire to Cusco, the capital, but it was more like forced tribute. There were some kind of trading systems, like people actually traveled this by road, and they carried some specific goods like shells and things like that, like fish, shells, because coastal trade, again, was quite relevant. Fishing was a huge aspect of the dietary component of people there, but not in the same magnitude as what we see in the Mesoamerica.
Thank you, Fernando. So maybe we have time for a final question. So there is a very interesting question. Professor Fernando already answered it, but maybe you can provide us additional details. It's about the trading routes. I mean, so you show that the main trade route was essentially north-south, essentially vertical. So, but what about a horizontal or east-to-west trade route? So have we any evidence? Can we say something about that? So already Professor Fernando in his lecture showed the America's position, like very vertical continent and so on. But
Yeah, I would say that
we know about that.
the main constraint is always geography. So if you look how America is shaped, is vertical, and it's much more difficult to travel vertically, mostly because of the changes in environment. So one of the things is that when you look into in horizontal, it's kind of the same environment. I mean, that's how the equator, if you're in the equator, that's kind of tropics, that tropical environment. That means that if you move, it doesn't matter if you move for a lot of distance, it will always be kind of the same environment. But if you move north and south, you start kind of see rapid changes in the environment you face. So that kind of course, limits the potential of trading that you have. Now, that don't imply that there was no trading from west to east, but it is limited. So when you look into, for example, in the Incas, the road systems, you see that, of course, the main roads were north-south always, but there were connections between the Andes, because there was always the need to go from the coast to more close to the mountains. So that's kind of of course, it's very close. So it's maybe you do not consider east and east-west trade, but that's kind of east-west connection. And the same things you see in Mesoamerica, where there is kind of a larger room. So you see kind of connections between populations in Oaxaca and populations that are closer to the Pacific and populations that are closer to the Gulf of Mexico or to the Caribbean. Of course, if you look into South America, it's huge, and just passing the Andes, there's a huge jungle. So interaction between societies, if that's what the question was implying, well, it was not possible just because there was no incentive in the first place to try to do it.
Okay, let me point out something that I have seen in several questions, and then we wrap up. We really don't want to abuse anyone. Just to remind people, the videos of the lectures and the slides are in the web page of the course. So if you are missing a reference, if you are missing a map, if you want to review some of the aspects, please go to the web page of the course where you register, you click on topics, and the slides are there, and we are also posting all the videos like around 24 hours after we finish. Okay, and that because several people were saying, oh, I missed that reference, I missed that other reference. Everything is there. Yes. In case you forgot.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, the videos are on the YouTube channel. So find everything. Okay, so thank you very much. So sorry.
Yep. No, just wrap up.
So thank you very much, Fernando, and thank you, everybody, to connect to this second lecture. We encourage you to come back on Thursday. So we will have a seminar about this topic. Yeah, thank you, and have an excellent rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.